Hi, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you to Chicago Ideas Week for hosting me so that I can talk about why I think that refugees should still be admitted to the United States, contrary to apparent popular belief. So I'm the director of the International Refugee Assistance Project. Our name's been in the news a lot because we're actually the named plaintiff in the lawsuit that's been up and down to the Supreme Court all summer about the Muslim ban. International Refugee Assistance Project v. Trump, aka the chapter of my autobiography about 2017. So I was sitting there listening to them talk about tennis and feeling like I had a little bit of this like up and down ball watching situation. My own interest in refugees started between my first and second years at law school. I was doing a totally unrelated human rights internship in Israel, and long story short, the NGO just didn't have very much for me to do. And it turns out that in Israel, the law is mostly practiced in Hebrew, which I didn't speak, which I probably could have figured out before I went, except that at Yale Law School, they don't teach you things like how to use the internet. So I didn't do that. And I found myself sitting in this air-conditioned office in Tel Aviv watching Mad Men. And it's a really good show. And John Hamm is really pretty. But at the time, there had only been 2 seasons, so I pretty quickly ran out of episodes. And I'm really obsessed with efficiency, and I really hate being bored. So I was sort of like, what am I doing? Like, I'm just sitting here. I need to find something to do. And the way that I got my news then, which is the way that I get my news now, which I suspect is the way that many of you get your news, is that I like wake up every morning and I have the 19 internet sites that I go through, and I read really quickly through all the headlines, and then I'll read maybe the full text of the article about what Beyonce's twins wore, like underneath the Nets game last night. So I had a very superficial understanding of, and also one of those sites is The Onion, so then you get confused about. Which, to be fair, I feel like you can read the New York Times for satire these days, but that's a different lecture for a different time. So somehow, I was aware that the US had invaded Iraq. I had some strong feelings about it. Our organization, which started out helping Iraqi refugees, didn't take an official position on the invasion of Iraq. When people would say, well, what does IRAP think about the Iraq war? And I'd say, well, we think that it happened. And that now we should probably do something about all the people who are suffering as a result. So sitting in Israel, I kept hearing about these millions of Iraqi refugees in Jordan that somehow I had totally not managed to read about remotely, and felt that as a US citizen, I had some kind of obligation to go to Jordan and talk to people and learn about the humanitarian fallout of my own country's foreign policy. So I emailed everybody who I could think of with this strange email that was like, hey, do you know any Iraqi refugees who might want to talk to me? And through a very attenuated series of individuals, I ended up being able to go to Jordan in August of 2008 and to meet with 6 families. And I expected what I would say would be like standard humanitarian challenges. I expected people not to have access to food or healthcare or education or adequate housing, and those things were all true. But what really surprised me is that every single person I met with identified their primary problem as essentially legal, which is that, I think, do people know the song Closing Time by Semisonic? So I happen to think that the chorus of that song like perfectly sums up the legal regime for refugee processing in the world, which is essentially, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. And that's not a very good legal situation to be in because, as the song sort of points out, it's a complete paradox. Refugees, in order to get recognized by the UN, which is a prerequisite for getting any sort of foreign aid, or to get resettled to a third country where they can be safe, have to go through this crazy series of interviews and paperwork submissions. And everyone I talked to was somewhere in this process, but they had no idea where. They were pretty sure they were on a wait list. They all knew a neighbor or a cousin's dog's owner's cousin who had, hung around long enough and eventually gotten a phone call saying, okay, your name's up on the wait list, you can go to Canada, you can start over. But none of them knew what the hell was happening to them. And so at the end of the week, I was super confused and pretty pissed. I had no idea what was coming in 2017, or I would have felt more zen at the time in preparation. And I finagled a meeting with the US Embassy in Amman, essentially by faking an issue with my passport, because the only people who answer the phones at the US Embassy in sort of conflict or conflict-adjacent zone countries are US citizen consular services. And I met with this poor woman. I said, I'm a student at Yale Law School. I'm interested in this refugee gig that you guys have going on. You know, is there someone I can talk to? And she very wisely got me someone from Public Affairs, who got someone from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees on the phone, and they were walking me through this process, and it continued to not make any sense to me. And in retrospect, I understand now it's because the process by which the world processes, to use that word too many times, refugees, is totally nonsensical and hasn't been updated since 1951. Which is something I think that we all need to work on, except that right now we're all really busy defending the very existence of a refugee procedure in the first place, so it's been a little hard to make improvements as of late. And I felt like even if I didn't understand the process well enough to explain it to people, at the very least I could figure out how long the wait list is. Because I think what's really important to keep in mind about refugees, and I think people have been experimenting with a lot of different narratives around refugees recently to try to convince us that we should take refugees in. I think for a long time it was refugees are victims, and we privileged Americans must help them, and I find that sort of objectifying. And I also don't think refugees are victims. I think they're survivors. And now there's this sort of like refugees, they're just like us. If you read Gossip Mag, you know, they like send their kids to school, they cook dinner at night. It's like, yes, but they do that in the middle of a war zone. So maybe they're a little better than us. But what I, as an advocate, love about working with refugees is that they are some tenacious fighters. They are people who have been through things that you and I cannot, well, maybe some of you, but I cannot even really imagine, and who still get up and send their kids to school and cook dinner in the evening, who went through really heinous persecution in the countries they came from and then got out and are fighting so hard for something better. And it's really a privilege for me to be able to advocate for people who want to advocate so hard for themselves. So I thought at the very least I could find out how long is this wait list and give people some idea, you know, if you can just hang in there for another 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, you'll get a phone call, but at least give people enough information that they can make a plan. And so I asked them, you know, how long is the wait list for refugees? And they said, what wait list? And I've thought about this a lot, not just because it's a really good metaphor for talking about how screwed refugees are in the current geopolitical system, but also because I don't think that the wait list is a nefariously propagated rumor by the US and the United Nations to placate people into accepting their, you know, really crappy fate. I think it's a rumor that comes from within the refugee community themselves, because if you live at the bottom of a deep, dark hole, in order to get out of bed in the morning, you have to believe that there's some kind of light at the top. And the fact that the best symbol of hope that the community could come up with was a wait list, which is literally the epitome of an inefficient and dysfunctional bureaucracy, struck me as so tragic that I felt obligated to try to go back to school and do something about it. So myself and another law student started an extracurricular organization that at the time was called the Iraqi Refugee Assistance Project. And we began pairing students with pro bono lawyers to represent refugees trying to navigate these systems. And as of, let's pick a random date, November 7th, 2016, you guys are easy. I haven't even had to curse yet. We had chapters at 29 law schools. We were working with more than 75 law firms and 9 multinational corporations. We had provided legal advice to 20,000 cases. And to date, we've passed 8 different pieces of legislation through Congress. Creating new rights and visas for 160,100 people. And the really important statistic to note is that 2 of those pieces of legislation have actually been passed since January 20th, which for those of you keeping track at home is exactly 2 more pieces of legislation than President Trump has passed in the same period of time. Our organization has really been apolitical, but you cannot be neutral on a moving Donald Trump. And I spent a lot of time in the months between November and January of 2016 to 2017, trying to figure out what are we going to do, right? Clearly, Syrian refugees in particular, Muslim immigrants, the refugee system as a whole is under an incredible, unprecedented existential threat. I am sitting on top of this, not literally, but sort of army of thousands of law students and lawyers who want to do something about it. What is the something? And the president was kind enough to give me an immediate answer. So he was inaugurated on January 20th. He took the weekend off to go golfing. Yeah. And on Monday, January 24th, someone texted me a photo of a desktop monitor in the White House that had a copy of the first Muslim ban on it. That did exactly what the ban ended up doing. So we called everyone that we knew who had a valid visa to enter the US, and we said, get on a plane. Drop what you are doing and get on a plane. The doors to the US are closing. We don't know when they're going to open again. We got law firms to chip in for people's plane tickets, and we had dozens of our clients arriving every day that week. And that Wednesday, we actually had a transgender client arriving into LAX, and we'll call her Katie. And I always get nervous when our transgender clients travel because their identity documents don't match their identity, right? They have a different name usually, they list a different gender, sometimes other things are different. Usually I'm concerned about what that means for them trying to exit. This time I was worried about what that would mean for them trying to enter. So we sent a lawyer to sort of quietly wait in the arrivals lounge at LAX just in case Katie had problems getting in. And thankfully she did not. She's doing really well now. But later that night, I was talking to my policy director, and I realized that Katie wasn't the only person who was going to have a problem when the executive order came down. That literally, whenever it dropped, there were going to be thousands of people on planes, like over the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean, who, when they took off from their countries, had legal permission to enter the US, but would land essentially as undocumented aliens. And nobody knew what the hell was going to happen to them. So at January 27th at 4:30, the order was signed. We put out a call for lawyers around the countries to gather at airports because no one knew what would occur. And in fact, the government did attempt to turn the airports into black sites. And we found that out first because they detained one of our clients. Hamid Darwish had worked as an interpreter for the US and Iraq for 10 years. That means that he had a total of 21 military intelligence level security clearances that found that he wasn't a threat. And yet when he landed in the US, he was separated from his wife and kid, shackled to a chair, handcuffed, and kept in a cell at JFK. So we stayed up all night, and at 5:30 a.m., we filed a lawsuit on behalf of anyone who might be detained anywhere in the country under the travel ban. And we wanted to file it before any international flights took off, because we didn't want the government to be able to deport anyone before they had had their day in court. We had a hearing at 7:30 that night, and at 8:30, the judge ruled in our favor, and 2,100 people were released from custody all over the country. So it took us 28 hours from when the ban was signed to get it invalidated, and by the time the second ban came around, we didn't want to go that slowly. And then we just won the lawsuit against the third ban 2 days ago. And winning lawsuits is fun. It's really fun. But what struck me the most, I didn't get to JFK until about noon on Saturday. And I had no idea that there were protesters. I knew that there were thousands of lawyers because I had spent the night going back and forth between a petition for a writ of habeas corpus and this like insane, really poorly organized spreadsheet of where all the lawyers were. And I got to JFK and there were thousands of protesters outside chanting, "Let them in. Let them in." And I called my deputy legal director and I was like, where the hell is everybody and what's going on? But in thinking back, that was really, I think, the most meaningful part of the weekend. It wasn't that the lawyers all went out to sit at airports. It was that so many other thousands of people followed and demanded that all of these refugees and immigrants and anyone else caught up in this dragnet of a ban be let into the country. And I think about my own family. I'm Jewish. I'm actually, my grandmother lives in Skokie, so I'm going to go hang out with her tonight. That's my hometown humor for you. That's all I have. And And I think about the ship, the St. Louis, which a lot of you guys have probably heard of. It was a ship that it was trying to carry Jewish refugees from Europe to find safety in the US. And it went from port to port to port all along the East Coast, and nobody would let them in. And eventually the ship returned, and they've actually traced what happened to a lot of the people on the ship, and most of them were killed in camps. And I can't help looking back on that and thinking, what if at every port the St. Louis had docked at, 2,000 Americans had showed up on a Saturday afternoon and stood there chanting, "Let them in, let them in." And I think that history only repeats itself if we let it. So I ask you, as people who cheered when I came on the stage and said I wanted to talk about refugees, and so presumably feel somewhat invested in the refugee policy of the United States, to not allow yourself to get distracted by the shiny objects that this administration is constantly throwing at you in the news, to keep an eye on the situation of what's happening to immigrants from Muslim countries, to refugees, to people who come here seeking safety, and when given the opportunity to stand up and raise your voice and say, "Let them in." Thank you so much.